Hi everyone, we are going to be speaking about the Janissaries today. Who are the Janissaries? They were an elite military force, specifically recruited by slavery, and which were one of the keys that allowed the Ottoman Empire to defeat its rivals, to step out from all the competitors out there in Western Anatolia and become the primary power of the region. Now, let's look into what they are and how they work just a bit more closely. This, by the way, is a picture of a Janissary. You can see here the special white cap that is characteristic of the Janissaries, basically a sort of long white fabric around a headband that's draped back, and you can see that here in this Ottoman painting from the 17th century. On the left is a Western painting, but you can see the same headdress, and these are war captives being led back to the capital. Now, in the previous classes, we've talked about how the Ottomans moved from a very small little principality, emirate, beylik, as it was, in the period of Osman, so the early 14th century, and quickly expanded, was in constant contact, both competition and alliance, with the Byzantines, and specifically were able to move into the world of the Balkans, unlike other beyliks or other principalities. Now, that was part of their success, but they also had success because they were able to organize new forms of armies, more centralized armies, other than kind of nomadic Turkic raiders. So if we look at the three main fighters, types of fighters or parts of the army at that time, we're looking at three basic types. The first is the akinci, the raiders. Raiders are basically on horseback, moving in quickly, coming into villages on the frontier, into enemy territory, grabbing and attacking whatever they can, and then quickly running back before they are confronted with a larger, more professional army. What are they grabbing? They're grabbing goods, they're grabbing animals, they're grabbing people, and then selling those either to merchants, slave merchants that followed them along the way, or taking those back into the capital cities and selling them at a higher profit. In any case, they were limited in a sense by what they could carry. And they were a quick force, a large force that was pushing the frontier ever forward, right? They were moving raids all the way into essentially Italy, in parts of what's today kind of Slovenia, etc., as well as into the borders of Hungary and so forth. And they struck fear into the local population. But there was two other basic components of the military, and these became much more important over time. These are the sipahis. Sipahi means essentially a horseman in Persian. A sipahi in this case is cavalry. And they are recruited not by essentially spoils from war like the kinjis. They're not paid that way. They're paid through a sort of what's called a sort of feudal tax, essentially. They are given the right to collect taxes on a district, depending on how big the district is and how much taxes it comes. In return, every campaign season, that sipahim, or let's say that what's called a timar holder, is supposed to bring a certain number of sipahis to battle with him. So if it's a very big province, it could be 100, 200, and he's supposed to kit them out, give everything they need for them, and support them. If it's a smaller province, maybe he's just bringing 10 to 20. So these guys are paid, but they're paid often in exchange. Basically, they're given the right to collect taxes on a piece of land. That land would then be redistributed every campaign season, and so or every few campaign seasons. And so the money never directly came from the hands of the government. And then there was the third type, which were supposed to be kind of the super elite, super loyal types of soldiers, infantry soldiers, not on horseback, who are being raised by or recruited through slavery. And the important thing here is that they are being paid a wage. So they don't always stay slaves. They actually get manumitted, as we'll see. But afterwards they get paid a wage, a very high wage. So they are actually being paid directly in money by the government. So as I said, this is part of the creation of this feudal cavalry, the Sipahis and the Janissaries are one of the ways that this nascent Ottoman state, especially under Murad I, is slowly trying to centralize. They're creating differences, especially through their tax regimes, by creating the distinction between military and non-military classes. The military class doesn't pay taxes. The non-military or flock, what's called the Ra'aya, it does pay taxes. And by creating these distinctions, they're already splitting up the egalitarian open world of the frontier into a more structured, centralized state, for better or worse. And they're ultimately also recruiting Byzantine elites as they move into these territories and take control of them. So let's get into it. What is a Janissary and where are they coming from? Now, these are elite soldiers and administrators. We're going to get into the administrative part in a section, in the next section. But what they are essentially slaves. They're taken as slaves from Christian villages in the Balkans and Anatolias, from the lands that the Ottomans themselves held. Now, what's interesting is that technically this isn't allowed according to Islamic law. It was very common to have armies made of slaves before, but the slaves usually came from beyond the borders of the Islamic world. They came from the Caucasus, from Russia, from the Turkic lands, etc., where they were captured in raids and then brought to slave markets and then bought and then trained as soldiers. But here what they're doing is they're taking children, often from Bosnia and Serbia, but sometimes also from different parts of Anatolia, in training them ultimately to be the elite administrators and military soldiers of the empire. They preferred Bosnians and Serbians because they thought they were taller, better looking, smarter, and more athletic. But they would, take people from various different parts. And the whole point here is to create an army that was more loyal, more stable, and better organized than the semi-nomadic frontier warriors that they had started with. And in fact, that's why the term Janissary literally comes from the word new army, because it's a different type of army. Now, on the right here, you see the one and only visual depiction we have of this process of recruitment, probably commissioned by a former child who had been recruited through this process and wanted to dedicate it. He had succeeded very well in the Ottoman government and had the money and resources to essentially pay for something very expensive, which is an illustration, a painting. And this would be found in a book. What you can see here on the left on this DS is a Janissary, told by the headdress, and here's another one over here, and a scribe who is going out and recording the descriptions of these people. It seems like there's some coins in the hands of this Janissary leader. He's probably paying the parents whose children were taken. But you can also see that the parents were obviously unhappy with this. There's this woman with her hands up. The priests are fighting with the Janissaries. There's a crowd gathered around. It's not clear what's going to happen. Obviously, this is probably a traumatic event for the children themselves. And we'll get back into it whether or not these figures actually had still connections to their home villages or not. So what happens to them after they get recruited? Where do they go when they get sent back to the capital? First, they get sorted out. Okay, so there's a process in the village themselves called the devshirme. It's called the selection. And that process continues when they get sent back to the capital. First, they get sent to a farm, a Turkish-speaking farmer. They get basically put on a farm to work with these farmers, where they learn the language, they acculturate, and then after a year or two, they take them again and they kind of sort them out. They say, well, let's see which ones are actually smart and which ones are more, have other gifts, as we would say. The ones that were clearly more gifted, more intelligent, were put on the track to become administrators. And what's interesting is that this dev shirmei process was the only way you could become an administrator, a governor, a prime minister, etc., a major member of the government, essentially, between 1400 and 1600. In other words, for many of the positions in the government, being a freeborn Muslim barred you from entering the government. You could not enter the elite. You can only do it through slavery. So those kids were sent to the inner courtyard of the palace. In that palace, you would then be trained in different arts, all sorts of Islamic law, all sorts of things. They would get the full education of prince. And in fact, the princes were studying with them, and that created deep bonds between the princes and these administrators when the prince became sultan. If they didn't make it to that, then they would go down the route of basically becoming soldiers, elite infantry soldiers, and they would be sent to the barracks for further training as soldiers. Now, when they become soldiers, they are organized into regiments, what are called ojaks. Now, an ojak means a hearth or stove, and in fact, everything about the Janissaries has some sort of culinary, kitchen-based terminology. So the head of a regiment is called a chorbaji. When there's a bunch of other kitchen-related ranks in their regiment, and every week the sultan would sort of make a ceremonial donation of meat to the Janissaries. They would take it and then cook it, distribute the soup, and it was a sort of symbolic gesture of the sultan giving the Janissaries the food. Now, if they wanted to rebel, as they would centuries later in the 1600s, but we're getting ahead of ourselves, what they would do is essentially turn over their giant soup pot and show symbolically that they refused the sultan's meat, that they refused the sultan's food, and therefore they were turning against him. One of the interesting things is also that these regiments were closely tied eventually to the cult figure of Haji Bektash. Haji Bektash was a Sufi saint. We talked about him. He had a frontier fort and following in the 1200s and 1300s. But as the Janissaries became more and more important, the Bektashis, the followers of Haji Bektash, made inroads into turning the Janissaries into their followers. And so the Janissaries became very closely tied to this Bektashi Sufi order as well. Now, we can also ask, did these children recruited in the villages continue to have knowledge or connection to their homes? Because in the end, they weren't taken as small children. They were taken as kind of young teenagers, early adolescents. So they remembered where they came from. They remembered their families. And in fact, we can look at the example of Sokulu Mehmed Pasha. Sokulu Mehmed Pasha is from a village called Sokul in Bosnia. They are basically, he is one of the most successful figures of the period. He served as prime minister under the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He had great success and led a number of campaigns for the Ottoman armies. And in fact, he was so successful that he ended up building a mosque. But before he did that, I want to talk about his brother, Makariye. Makariye was his younger brother, and he was also apparently gifted, and he was taken, he wasn't taken as in the Dev Shirmeh, he wasn't taken as a slave. Instead, he entered the church and became eventually the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church. In other words, he became the head of the Christian church in the Ottoman Empire. So two brothers at the height of their power and through two different tracks. Now, what's interesting is that Sokulu Mehmed Pasha built for himself a mosque to commemorate all of his achievements and to use his patronage. But to help his brother and to commemorate their connection, he built a church for him in their hometown. Now, the church is no longer standing, apparently, so you have to imagine with this picture. But it shows that there is still a vision of connection between these people and their families. Now, we can ask, were the Janissaries slaves? Technically, they were taken as slaves. They were, of course, manumitted at a certain age, around 20. and they were paid wages afterwards, right? So they're no longer slaves at that point, but they were taken and turned into slaves and then released. In fact, one of the ways that we can define slavery is the idea of tearing someone out of their social context. They become socially dead in their original context and then re-enter into a new one. And this is what is happening. By the way, we're not talking about millions of people recruited through the Dev Shirme. We're talking about probably a few thousand, maybe 1,000 a year, maybe in total 20 to 40,000, if that, because initially the number of Janissaries is very small. When Mehmed II conquers Constantinople and sets up a new palace, he has about 1,000 Janissaries around him, right? So we're not talking about gigantic amounts of people. This is much smaller than, for example, the mass slavery that occurred in the Americas, but it was a form of slavery. And in fact, they were referred to as slaves, which is the word kul. In fact, everyone who worked for the dynasty, for the sultan, was considered a slave. And this was through the term kabekulu, slaves of the port, slaves of the government, of the dynasty. And they were, even though they were eventually freed, and therefore they were part of this kind of askari, military administrative class that was separate from the ra'aya. That means they didn't pay taxes. They were part of the ruling class, right? And again, the only way you could enter this ruling class often at this point was through slavery, which is an interesting turn on our general conception of slavery. And because of that, that meant that the children of Janissaries couldn't follow their father's footsteps. They could not become a Janissaries themselves. They had to find some other profession, such as being a professor, a judge, or a trader, or something else. So it's always worth asking, are these people slaves? One last point, even after the process of recruiting Janissaries through slavery ended around 1600, these figures were still called, everyone, even though they were all freeborn Muslims, still called slaves. So it's a general idea. It's about loyalty to the Sultan and to the dynasty. Now, as I pointed out before, the idea of having a slave army wasn't something new. What was new was the fact that they were taking these Christians from the villages under their protection, which wasn't technically allowed. But many other places in the Islamic world had slave armies. You basically could recruit an army from nomads or from slaves. Okay? And if the Ottomans just looked to the south of where they were in what's today Cairo and Egypt and Syria, they had a kingdom called the Mamluk kingdom. Mamluk literally means slave in Arabic. And these competitors to the Ottomans essentially took the final step in which the slaves, rather than following the Sultan, overthrew the Sultan back in 1250 and made themselves Sultan. And every time a Sultan died, there would be a sort of election sort of fight, and that the Mamluks would, these military slaves would decide amongst themselves who would be the next Sultan. And the only way you could enter the Mamluks is through, again, slavery. They would continue to recruit new Mamluks through slavery, mostly from the Caucasus. So the idea of having a slave army was not new. And in fact, the same dynamic of having a slave army that became rulers actually became common also in northern India in what's called the Delhi Sultanate. And many other parts of the Islamic world continued to recruit elite slaves and to constitute an elite through slavery. Now, if we look in central India, in the Deccan, in this place, for example, in Ahmednagar, but also in Hyderabad and other places, there were many slaves, elite slave administrators, some of whom actually became rulers, such as this guy, Malik Ambar. He is from an Ethiopian background, and he was essentially the ruler of Ahmednagar. So there was always ways for slaves, actually. The point is, being a slave is not, in this case, is a form of elite slavery. It's a form of creating an elite and a set of rulers. Now, I would ask to you, what would you consider Janissaries to be slaves? And if you're a ruler, would you trust a slave to rule? or to be an administrator? And in particular, what is it that makes slaves trustworthy? Now, when we contemplate these questions, we often bring to them an idea of slavery as the opposite of individuality, as the death of freedom, essentially. But this isn't the way that they thought about it. Especially rulers, they trusted these slaves not because, as you might think, that they were able to indoctrinate them from a young age and turn them into some sort of mindless robots. Not at all. In fact, they wanted them to be able to think and work at the highest levels on their own. Why did they become trustworthy? Well, they become trustworthy because the idea of slavery is social death, because they wanted an army that wasn't loyal to the local context. So if they had soldiers, those soldiers would come from a village or be attached to some sort of Sufi sheikh or something. They would be attached to some other local power holder. And when you have that, then you have mixed loyalties. They're not just loyalty to the dynasty, the sultan, the government. They're also loyalty to their local world. But when you take a slave, that person is only loyal to the sultan and ultimately to the person paying their wage and to the person who trained them. And this makes them, in the minds of medieval and early modern Islamic rulers, an a logical choice with which to create an army or to create a set of administrators. So again, it's not about indoctrination. It's about creating, removing social bonds that would compete with loyalty with that of the sultan. And that's why, for example, if you wanted the most loyal type of slave, would be one who's not only detached from his parents and from his community, but also detached from his children. And how would you do that? That's by making a eunuch. So a eunuch is both a slave in that when they're taken through slavery, right? So they don't have connections to their parents or their homelands anymore, but they also can't have children. So they only can dedicate their energies to the ruler. Think about it. Until next time.